the reason I want to talk about class is when we have a good understanding of class, we have an explanatory model that will give us insight into a lot of what's happening in our political, social, and economic world, right? So, and if we lack a good class analysis, then we're susceptible to misunderstanding what's happening in our world, and we will be inhibited from or prohibited from actually successfully changing the world, right? If we don't understand how things work, we're going to be pretty ineffectual in changing things. Sometimes you'll hear the reference of blue-collar and white-collar workers. So actually sometimes there are ways of classifying people in the economy, in economic production, based on color. And of course, blue-collar is supposed to signify somehow unskilled or manual or low-skilled manual labor, and white-collar is supposed to somehow indicate higher-skilled, managerial, etc. That doesn't tell us what class is, right? Just talking about blue-collar or white-collar doesn't tell us what class is. In a very important way, there's something it misses, and it misses the relationship between classes, right? And this is going to be incredibly important to having a good, solid class analysis, is that classes are related inherently to each other, right? Unlike classifying people by your shirt or jacket colors, right? There's no relation. The people wearing red can go their way, and the people wearing green can go their way, and there's no inherent relationship between those two groups. But with economic classes, there's an inherent relationship. And once we can identify that, right, then we have made a great strides in having a class analysis of our social world, right? A class relation, right? So blue collar, white collar doesn't really do it. Elitist, real Americans distinctions doesn't really do it. They miss also the essential relationship between the classes. So if we want to understand class, we have to look more directly at economic classes and not just social classes, right? We turn to economic power and economic class, then things become very clear and stark, the distinctions. I write here the 1% own over 50% of all stocks and mutual funds, over 60% of all business equity, approximately 40% of all trusts, and 30% of all real estate. That's the 1% that owns that. If you look at the top 20%, they own, or did own before the recession, 85% of all wealth in the United States. But let's talk about the distinction between wealth and income, because these are statistics about wealth, right? 20%, the top 20% in this country own 88% of the wealth, but wealth is not income, right? Wealth is your assets minus your liabilities. Assets can be things like homes, businesses, stocks, right? And liabilities are debt, obligations to pay someone something for some reason, right? So an income is incoming wages or salary, right? So it's definitely possible, and right now probable, that you have income but no wealth. The top 1% controlled 50% of U.S. financial assets, while the bottom 90% had 14%. So 90% of the country had 14% of the financial assets. The top 1% had 50%. And I love this one. The average pre-tax income for the lower 90% of households, this is since 1979, is $900 less. Now $900 less than it was in 1979. So for 90% of the population in the United States, since 1979, their pre-tax income has gone down. The average pre-tax income for the top 1% is over $700,000 more than in 1979. These differences in wealth affect groups differently. what we traditionally call the middle class has most of their wealth in their homes, right? That's where their asset is. It's in their home that they bought with a mortgage. Many have paid it off, right? But this is exactly where the foreclosure crisis hit. And it hit different populations differently, right? So, of course, and since 2007, wealth in homes has dropped 36%. So we have lost 30% or 36% of wealth in homes since 2007. In the black community, that's over 50%. So over 50% of all wealth in the black community, because it's almost all tied up in homes, has been lost in the last 5 years. The idea here is that when a crisis hits, like in the housing market, if all of the wealth is tied up in homes, you are essentially doing a reset button, right? You have all of your wealth is wiped out. That means all of the assets that can possibly save you or that you can lean on or to support you if you lose your job are gone, right? And this is why you hear all these stories, and the media loves to talk about these stories because they're so dramatic. You have middle-class people making sometimes six figures whose debt exceeded their wealth, and so when they lost their jobs, there was no recovery. They have nothing to lean on. They were living check to check. I'm living check to check, right? Most people are living check to check. This is why the foreclosure crisis is so essential. So, let that go. We haven't talked about class conflict and the role of the police yet. We will in a moment. Okay, so I've been talking about wealth. And we talk about the 1%, we talk about the 99%. And the idea here is that wealth is not the main category of class. Wealth is essential to class. Wealth is produced by class relations, but wealth is not what makes a class, right? What makes a class is control over means of production, owning capital. So basically, there are those who have capital and then can invest that capital in manufacturing or service industries or lend out that capital for interest in sometimes very simple ways, student loans, mortgages, car loans, credit cards, and sometimes very complex ways, buying credit default swaps, very complicated financial mechanisms. These are, in the financial industries, just ways of lending money and getting interest from that. Derivatives are basically payback from the money you've, in a sense, invested, right? So if you have capital to put into production, to put into services, to lend to people, and also if you own property and land that you can rent, housing that you can rent, that puts you in one class. If you don't have that capital, then you work for people who do. Is it that simple? Pretty much. It's that simple, actually. Yeah. I mean, often we're not actually in direct contact with those who actually own and are profiting from what our work is doing, producing, or our services. But because there's some middle person there who makes probably more than we do, but they don't actually own the office or own the company or own the factory, right? But it is the case that these are the general classes in our society. There are those who have capital who can employ people, and there are those who don't, who work for people, who are employed by those people, right? And what we've seen in the last 30 years is that middle class that had some equity in homes, right, maybe had small businesses, maybe were managerial mid-level people in corporate, kind of corporate America, that they're all disappearing, right? This is the crisis of the middle class. What is happening to them? They're not going up, they're going down, right? And that's why this 99% is starting to resonate more and more and more, because the amount of people that are subject to the will and control of those who actually have capital is growing, right? And the concentration of capital is increasing. So the 1% isn't just rhetorical. The 1% over the last 30 years has quadrupled their capital, their wealth. I'll explain capital and wealth in just a second. So just to anticipate the question that I posed on kind of the advertisement for this teach-in, is the 99%, is the claim that Occupy is the 99%, is that a claim about class? And I would say, yes, basically it is about class. Although not all 99% of people in this country identify with Occupy, it's in a sense kind of anticipating trends. The 99% are becoming more impoverished, right? And the 1% is becoming enriched, right? So there's certainly an objective, material, economic trend that goes along with the slogan, the 99 versus the 1%. Okay, what's the difference between capital and wealth? I said that wealth is not an indicator of class. Romney, I just heard today, I don't know when he did it, but he gifted to his sons, all 5 sons, each of them $20 million, right, so that he wouldn't have to pay taxes on it. So their sons, the Romney sons, are very wealthy now, right? They're all in the 1%. But that $20 million is wealth. It isn't necessarily capital, because it hasn't yet been employed or deployed in production or investment in service industries or lent out for profit or interest, right? That's when wealth becomes capital. So not all wealth is capital. Capital is wealth put into the production process. And the way to increase value with capital is to employ people, for people to labor, right, in services or in production. Or if you're lending people to pay the money back, right? Most of us know that feeling. Okay. So now we come to the point where we see how classes are related. The 1% and the 99% aren't just residing next to each other. They aren't, the 1% is not just those people who live on that side of the park or that part of the city, or those who you see sometimes in the windows of those nice restaurants. There is a direct and essential relationship between you and them, right? Because everything that you're doing, unless you're self-employed, you have your own business, everything that you're doing is working for someone else. All of the profit and value that you're producing in your work in a factory or in your office work or as a teacher, right? I'm a professor, so students come in and they pay tuition, and I get a salary, right? All of those things are producing value. And in private industry, in private ownership, that value is going to the owner of the capital. And your wages, and if you have them, your benefits are some portion of the value that you've created coming back to you. And the essence of the system, of the capitalist system, is that the value that's produced by you and what you do, that most of that goes to those who own the capital, right? If it didn't, they wouldn't want to employ you, right? So you produce, and what you do, you produce surplus value, or that's actually what the Marxists call it. They call it surplus value. What the mainstream economists call it is value added. Same thing. That's what labor creates. And I mean labor in the most general sense. Like if you're just stapling papers, if you're filing folders, that's labor, right? Something is getting done, right? If you're answering phones, that's labor. This isn't just the old, I'm in a press in a factory, right? This is all of us have done some kind of labor, even if we haven't worked in a factory, right? And so that's what I'm talking about. And that's the essential connection. And this is where we get the origin of class conflict. Because if your labor in production or services is somehow tied to capitalist profit, then the conflict between classes will be over the surplus value that's produced by your labor. This is why organized labor is seen as such a threat to capital. What does it do? It organizes people who are working, and I don't mean just in factories, I mean in universities, in agricultural sector, et cetera. Organizes them to have stronger bargaining power to get more of the surplus value. Everything is being fought over the surplus value that workers produce. So if you're organized, you can call a strike, you can do a walkout, you can do a slowdown, right? If you're organized, you're a threat. You have greater bargaining power. So the greatest threat is to destroy that organization, right? It's not, we see this wave of anti-union legislation sweeping all the state capitals, right? And especially we saw it in Wisconsin, which is where I'm from. I'm very proud of the Madisonians there that took on Scott Walker. He's going to be in a recall election because of this. In Ohio, all over the place, because of place like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. They're promoting anti-union bills all over the country. What are they attacking? They're attacking public sector workers who are unionized. Who are they? They're teachers, firefighters, policemen, garbage collectors, right? These are not the kind of traditional, 1930s version of like the big white male union guys who, are, I don't know, going to slug it out with the capitalist bosses who have their armed thugs with them, right? These are kindergarten teachers. But they're unionized, so they have bargaining power to ask for better benefits, right? And that is a threat. And so the class conflict that's happening in those cases is not playing out as we traditionally think of class, because this is why people get away with using the word class warfare in the most ridiculous ways, is because we picture it as like this black and white scene of like the big white male union guys fighting the cigar chomping capitalists, right? And the battles are always on the factory floor or whatever. That's not where class conflict happens. It's happening in the state capitol. And it's not a class conflict between two parties. It's a conflict between the parties and the people. The majority of people in the U.S. Congress are millionaires. The 10 wealthiest congresspeople, their combined wealth is $2.2 billion. Most of them are Democrats, and all of them voted for Bush's tax cuts. This is not, there's a Labor Party, the Democrats, and then there's the Capitalist Party, the Republicans. Right? It's Democrats and Republicans voting for legislation that raises working people's taxes and cuts capital gains taxes, eliminates inheritance taxes, charges more for Medicare, Medicaid, makes them more difficult, tuition rising. That's class warfare. And we don't even, usually we don't even think of, we think of class warfare in domestic terms. All of the U.S. military endeavors, wars in the last 10 years in the Middle East, what was that about? That was about national interests, not national security. What are national interests? Those are economic interests. Are they national economic interests? I don't think so, right? Getting control over the region in the Middle East because of oil, either directly having access to oil or controlling the routes of its distribution, That's about capitalism. That's about fueling both our production and keeping a thumb on the scales to prevent competitors, capitalist competitors, from defeating us, right, in the economic world. So when we think about class warfare and the costs of class warfare, we can't somehow keep it just here and somehow not take into consideration the role of the state, right? Because the role of the state is essentially to facilitate capitalist accumulation. It does this through, right, military interventions, creating markets, stabilizing markets, expropriating resources. It does this through bailouts, your money, right? Going to industries and businesses that risk too much, and now we're bailing them out. They go toward, the state functions as the enforcer of contracts, the collector of taxes, and above all, the protector of property. All right? That is, if you go back, James Madison, every kind of ideological justification of the foundation of the American Republic is to protect property. First and foremost, to protect property. Now, one way we can read that is that, well, everyone's got a little property, that helps everybody. But when you look at the distribution of property that we just looked at, right, the function of the state is to protect that class who has all of that capital. Right? Now, when the state and the economy goes into crisis, as it has in the last several years, right? First we had a financial crisis, and then we had a crisis in terms of the state, the ability of the state to actually address and solve the problems in the economy. So that then put the state into crisis. When you have that crisis, the ideological justifications for everything that had been going on beforehand, how surplus value was distributed, how this class warfare was being perpetuated, all of that comes into the foreground, all those justifications, and we see how weak they are. We see how vulnerable they are. Right? All of a sudden, people start saying, yeah, that was a war for oil. And you know what? I don't want my sons and daughters, my parents, my brothers and sisters going to war to fight for oil. I would rather do something else. And wait a minute, you said you bailed out the banks, but you didn't bail out the homeowners? Wait, you're raising tuition? You're raising our taxes? Romney is actually proposing to raise taxes on the poorest of the poor and 50% and have 50% cuts for the wealthiest 1%. They would get over 57% of the gains in his tax program. This is insane. This is class war. Why is it happening right now? Why is it so in your face right now? Because the capitalist class and the state both know that they are vulnerable right now. And when this happened in the past, when we had the Depression, right, which was the last worst or kind of economic crisis that was even comparable to the one we have had since 2007, what do we get? We get the New Deal. We get the redistribution of wealth. We get the strong unions being formed. We get all of these things that are what? Taking away from surplus value going to the capitalist class. Right? This is the crisis that was created for capital between the Great Depression and the 1970s. The 1970s, we saw the outsourcing of production. We saw the financialization of capitalism as ways of circumventing all of the problems and barriers that had been put up to capital accumulation because of the response to the Great Depression. And they know that. They know that. They know they are susceptible and weak, and their justifications are vulnerable to critique now, right? And so this is why they double down. This is why Occupy represents such a threat, right? Not only is it calling them out on these justifications for the status quo, but it's actually presenting an alternative. It's talking about radical democracy. It's talking about some parts of it are even anti-capitalist, right? And so when you get large amounts of people who are starting to sympathize with this message, that's when you get the state in the form of police coming out to crush it. That's why you have mayors across the country coordinating efforts to evict Occupy, right? This is not an individual case basis in each city. This is a national attempt to uproot any kind of social movement which will hold a sign out and say, no more, right? We don't believe it anymore. We don't buy it anymore. And that's why you get this doubling down on the most vicious kind of class warfare, and you get militarized police repression of a social movement like Occupy. Right? That's why we're seeing this. You go out to a demonstration, you're outnumbered by the police. And they're big ninja turtles, covered in this military gear, and they have trucks that must have just come from Iraq. It's insane. It's insane. But it's only if you look at, well, they're just a bunch of people. They don't have arms. They're not even threatening anyone. It's not like Occupy is like, let's burn the Capitol, right? They're like, let's pitch a tent. Let's have a GA here and talk about some stuff, right? Let's have a committee meeting. Why is that so threatening? Because the state and the capitalist class are weak, right? And Occupy represents an alternative, and it's literally manifesting a form of critique. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the teach-in in a couple weeks, the next one. And so I'll end there. So let's talk about it. Let's have some discussion.
Good job.
Thanks.
Only questions. If you're going to ask a question, either repeat it. You already know this.
Yeah, sorry. I'll say it. Yeah, so
come up here up front and ask the question up front.
yeah, so because of the mic, if you want to come up, if you have a complicated question or comment, it's probably best that you come up and speak close to the mic. If you have a short comment, or question, I can just repeat it and then address it. And Therese here is going to take stack, so she's going to facilitate